Alrighty. So what we're going to do is this session, we're going to look at the third element of these three that Jesus highlights, brings out of the second tablet of the Ten Commandments. And so one way you could think about this is just as a triangle, that you've got anger that when retained, held on to, begins to distort and cause all kinds of problems in life. You then have various forms of, I'll just say, twisted desires, where and the basic idea behind epithemia, right, is that you have an intensity of desire that doesn't really match the value of what it's aimed at, or in some way distorts, twists, right, what it is that it's aimed at. Desire itself is not bad. God created us to desire, okay? It's just that our desires can get mangled, twisted, distorted, and then that causes a lot of problems in life, okay? And so then this third element that he works on is deceit, okay? And with it, deceit's kind of the heart of it, but it goes into what I just call speech sin in general, okay, or speech errors. And that's not grammatically speaking, okay? But these three, they fit together, and I said this before. I think a good way to think about this is that they're fundamental strategies for life. They're basic strategies for getting our way in a world if we're working by ourselves, if we're not part of God's kingdom. And that's really the only option, right? Either we're folded into God's kingdom, we're living and working in this world, knowing that we're doing something that God's doing, and so we're not the only person making things happen, or we either individually or in groups are trying to make it work on our own without God, right? And if we try to make it work on our own, we're going to need these three things to get our way, okay? Individually and as communities, okay? Now, different teachers, followers of Jesus, right, in the early years, kind of emphasize different ones of these. And so we pointed out that Jesus, he always starts with anger, and he deals a lot with this tendency, well, towards rebellion and all of that in the place where he lives. Okay, Paul spends a lot of time focused on desire problems. Right, and it's interesting. Jesus's brother James, right? The emphasis really falls on speech there, and so you remember towards the end of the book. But above all else, brothers, let your yes be yes, your no be no, right? And so he puts the emphasis more on the problem that comes with speech being misused, right? So these fit together, though, right? Now we'll remember. So let's go back. Let's look at kind of the Jesus's primary teaching here. In Matthew chapter 5, 33 through 37. And again, this is kind of, quintessential Jesus in terms of the way that he reads the law, reads the commands. So somebody read for us nice and loud, 33 through 37, Matthew 5.
Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one.
Thank you. All right. So you see the classic kind of pattern in Jesus here. You start with the written negative prohibition, don't do this, right? So he quotes, you've heard that it was said, to the ancients, you shall not swear falsely. Right? And then he moves beyond that back to a larger principle that's rooted at the level of heart. And then he offers a way forward, a positive direction, a different way of living than what most people would have assumed by reading that commandment. Okay? Now, in this case, it's one of the few places where, as you read through this, he doesn't explicitly mention the heart, but that's kind of because it's implied already. When you read through Scripture, part of what you know from the beginning is where do your words come from? Well, they're the overflow of the heart, right? And so there's already this connection there that when you talk about the heart, that part of you that zooms in, that focuses, that makes choices, that's also the part that does your conscious speaking, right? That's in control of your speech when you're paying attention, at least, right? Now, in order to kind of think through Jesus' teaching about speech and how it gets distorted, I want to zoom out and kind of ask a big picture question, okay? I want you to ask the question, why bother speaking? Okay? Now, you already asked that question, but in more particular ways. Like, why do I bother speaking to that man? He never listens, But I want you to kind of think about this in broader terms. Like, more generally, why bother speaking at all? Right? What are we doing when we kind of look at somebody and say something? Okay? And what is it that language is for? Right? And I think there's two elements to this. The first, we can just point out that we're created for dominion, right? We're created in order to have some say over this world, to shape it. God wants it to be different because we were here than it would have been otherwise. And so he created us with dominion, with agency, but he created more than one person that way, right? And so there's a certain element of language that's about coordination. We have a saying in English, I don't know if this translates well into every other language, but too many cooks in the kitchen spoil the soup, make the food bad. And the idea is if you have too many people trying to do something, then they fight or they mess up whatever it is they're working on, right? And that's true apart from speaking well with each other, right? And part of what speech does is it allows us to coordinate and to give way to each other. So that's an important element, but I think there's even a deeper layer to speech. And the best I know how to do this is to ask you to just kind of imagine a scenario, okay? So imagine that it's July, August, so hot you can barely breathe, right? And you're going to take a bus down to Halkidiki, okay? And so you get on the bus and you're looking for a spot where you can not be crowded because it's hot on that bus. And as you know, we don't turn on air conditioning because it'll kill you. And so what happens is you get on the bus and you find a spot where there's no seat, nobody sitting next to you, and it takes off, goes down the road. And at the first stop, though, somebody gets on, walks down the aisle towards you, and you're like, no, but poof, sits next to you. Okay? Complete stranger. Now, next to you on the bus, it's sweltering hot, the bus takes off. what happens next? What do you do? Huh? Yeah, like, so what often happens is something like this. You look at the person next to you and in, you know, whatever language, you say something as simple as, wow, it's hot in here, right? Now, I want you to think about that kind of utterance saying, like when you look at a stranger and you say, man, it's hot in here. You haven't really given any information that person didn't already have. Right? It wasn't like the person was like, oh, okay, yeah. You haven't asked them to do something about it. Right? There's no command and there's no request. Right? So what is it that's happening? Why is it that we feel this kind of need to say something as simple as, it's hot in here? What's that about? What is it in us? What do you think?
I don't know. I do it all the time. I don't know what it is. I have to remark on it. Especially
Okay. What?
A need to communicate.
Okay. Yeah. That's an interesting phrase. A need to communicate. Okay. Think about that word communicate. There's a word built around that. It's the word communion, right? And part of what we do when we speak with each other is that we open up like a shared space, if I can put it that way, right?
Break the ice.
Yeah, okay. We break the ice, and that's another way of saying there's a barrier that is gone now, right? And so part of what language is for is it just gives us something that's shared between us, right? And so it's a way of coming together. It's a way of having some kind of personal connection, a communion. And that's really basic. That's really basic because, again, you go back, it's not only, you know, at the beginning of Scripture, we not only find that we're created for agency, for dominion, we also find out it's not good for man to be alone, right? That we're created for connection as well, okay? And so speech is something that God gives us as a way of connecting both with each other, with human beings, and with God. Speech is for both of those, okay? Now, there's ways beyond words as well, yes, but that's what speech is for. Now, there's a problem, though, that emerges rather early, and you actually see this as soon as sin enters in. You find that language starts getting used in different ways. Instead of being used to connect and to speak truth in order to invite others to work with you in something with God, it begins being used in different ways. For instance, one of the first things that you find after sin is that it's used for blame and for shifting blame from oneself to somebody. Well, it's that woman. Well, it was that snake, right? And so we begin to use speech in different ways. And part of what is behind that is that I begin to, when in a condition of sin, in a condition of living apart from the kingdom, what happens is I start using speech primarily in order to get what I want. Okay, rather than to invite, to dignify, and to connect, I start thinking of it just as a tool to get something that I want, right? Now, the result is that there are some primary distortions, things that go wrong with speech. And in Jesus' teaching, I see three things that he points out. And the first one is here in this passage in Matthew chapter 5, verses 33 through 37. And I'm going to just call this the distortion of manipulation or deceit and deceit. Okay, in other words, Jesus is pointing out this kind of tendency that we have to begin to use speech in a way that bypasses or tries to prevent other people from thinking about clearly and making a decision about what they're going to do. And that's really what's behind the use of oaths here. So let me say a word about that. In the context, you go back to Jesus' world, taking an oath is very serious because it's supposed to be the end of the matter, right? An oath ends the matter. You have that in Proverbs, among other places. And so there's this sense that because God is overseeing things, and if you say something under oath, then God's going to intervene. And so people, they take that very seriously. But what happens then is that you have some people who start to kind of massage and try to distort which oaths count and which ones do not. Okay? And Jesus will talk about this later in Matthew in chapter 23. Remember, when he talks to the scribes, he says, woe to you because you say, anyone who swears by the altar doesn't have to keep the oath, but anybody who swears by the gift on the altar, right, he has to keep the oath, right? And there's a few other distinctions that are made there. But part of what happens is that you have, in Jesus' day, people who then kind of, they begin to try to draw these fine distinctions about which oath counts and you'll get, punished for not keeping, and which one doesn't count. And then the ones that don't count, you can use them in order to get people to do what you want, right? And so behind this is essentially a practice of saying something that sounds really impressive, but it has nothing to do with the issue at hand. Okay? And the reason to do that would be only to stop the person from thinking through and making a good choice as to whether or not they should buy this or not, right? So if I'm trying to sell something to you in Jesus' day, I might say, this cart, it's so well built, put it together myself, and I swear by the altar in Jerusalem, notice not the gift on it, right? By the altar in Jerusalem that, it'll go for another 10 years before the wheel breaks off, right? Well, why would I say that? Well, the point at which I would say it is when they're starting to look at the wheel, right? And it's a way of getting them to not do their own work, think about it, make a choice. It's trying to get them to just do what I want them to do without really deciding. Okay? Now, and what Jesus says here is that if you do that, right? He says anything beyond just yes, letting your yes be yes and your no, no, comes from either evil or the evil one. Okay? You can translate it either way. But either way you translate that, I'm sorry, I'm not thinking super coherently at the moment. Okay, let me back up just a bit. So he says it comes from evil, and instead of that, what one is to do is simply to speak clearly and to invite. Let your yes be yes, your no, no. Okay? So if you believe something is the case, you simply say, this is what I think is the case. Consider it. Okay? If you think that's not, if I think that's wrong, then I just say, no, I don't think that's how it is. Could you look again? Okay? And Jesus says anything beyond this respectful, honest, kind of upfront approach to speech comes from either evil or the evil one. Okay? Now we got to talk about that. So even if you translate it from the evil one rather than from evil, you then have to ask the question, well, why would it be the evil one that's behind it? And now you're back to what's evil about this, okay? So we need to ask the question, what is it that's evil or fundamentally wrong, morally wrong, about using speech in order to bypass somebody's thought, in order to manipulate them? And I think the answer is quite simple, and that is that it's an inappropriate way to deal with a person. Okay? Persons are created, again, with dominion, which means they have to make choices, and they're supposed to have some say over the world. And so when I try to stop a person from thinking through and making a choice within an area that is their own responsibility, I'm actually damaging them in a very deep way. Okay? And that's what's behind, it goes beyond just, it starts with things like this, manipulative speech. But if you look into even things like brainwashing and different forms of torture, what's behind that is trying to deprive a person, take away their capacity to think through something and make a choice. And it's deeply immoral. It's wrong. It harms another person. We have a need that's so deep it's even biological to choose what we're going to do based on what we see to be true and right and good. And if we take that away from a person, we're harming them. Okay? And so that's why lies and manipulative speech are so wrong, because it damages persons. Okay? Now, there's a number of ways in which we do that still today. Sometimes we, in fact, we have a whole kind of vocabulary for it in the West. We talk about somebody being a spin doctor, and there's a lot that goes into advertising that's nothing but trying to get people to act without choosing. We call that impulse buying, right? So there's all sorts of things, ways that this shows up today, but there's also religious versions of it. Sometimes we do things like name dropping. If we have, there's a famous person in our religious movement, and when I'm talking to somebody, I could just kind of say, well, when Jim and I were sitting around, talking the other day. And it has nothing to do with the conversation. It's just letting you know that I'm connected to this guy, right? And, so that's one of the things. In some contexts, well, in the Greek it says, or in the Hebrew it says, right? These can be used that way also, because in contexts where nobody can check, right? And so it's good to study Greek and Hebrew, but it's about the motivation behind saying that, right? And we need to examine that sometimes. Okay? All right. So we have this basic need to decide what we're going to do based on what we see to be good and true and right. And Jesus says, in order to do that, we need to be straightforward and honest. Okay? The second distortion of speech that that he deals with is a tendency to use kind of pressure tactics and disapproval in order to get people to do things. Okay? This is something like pushing advice, right? Pressure and I'll just say aggressive advice, if I can put it that way. That's what I'm missing, the advice. Okay. I made that a verb. Let's see here. Advice. Okay. The passage to look at here is Matthew chapter 7, first 12 verses. And in order to read this well, I think it's important that you start in verse 12 and then look up at what's above it, okay? Because there's a tendency to read chapter 7, verses 1 through 12 as if it switches themes, and it starts off with how you interact with human beings for the first 5 verses, but then in verse 6, that's often read as switching over to talking about prayer, okay? And I think prayer plays in, but I want you to notice in verse 12, when you get to the bottom of this passage, it says, therefore, and so this is summing up, it's bringing a conclusion from what was in the first part of this passage. He says, therefore, however you would have others treat you, or what you would want others to do for you, do the same thing to them. For this is the law and the prophets. Okay, sums up the law and the prophets. So when you get to the bottom of this whole section, he draws a conclusion about how we treat our neighbor. Okay, so with that in mind, let's read this, and somebody read for us real loud, chapter 7, verses 1 through 12, and then we'll talk through it for a moment.
Judge not, that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when there is the log in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Do not give dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and the one who knocks, it will be opened. Or which one of you, if his son asks him for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a serpent? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? So, whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets.
Okay, thank you. All right. So, remembering that, it sums up the law and the prophets with regard to how we interact with our neighbor. Okay? And it's characteristic of Jesus to say that you can't have two different ways of interacting with people. One for interacting with that person that we call God, or persons that we call God, right? And another for interacting with human beings. That fundamentally they're going to be the same, okay, in the end. And so what he does here in verses 1 through 5, he essentially talks about what happens when we begin to use displays of disapproval or condemnation in order to get somebody to do what we want them to do. Okay, and you think about it this way: what's going on with the speck in the log? Right? Very often, this is read as something like this. Like Jesus is saying, okay, make sure that you go and you kind of clean up the sin in your own life before you go and condemn your brother, so you can more effectively condemn him. Right? But that's not actually what's going on here. You have to ask the question, what is the log in my eye? And the thing is, I think that the log in my eye in this scenario actually is my desire to find something wrong with my brother, with my neighbor. It's this need I have to see something wrong in him or her. Okay? And it's very common to have this where you can think about it this way. So I'm a professional speck remover. Right? It's what I do. I look for little flaws and inconsistencies in other people. and I point them out. I pretend to be distressed by it. Like, I pretend that, oh, it really hurts me to have to say this. But the truth is that I kind of like it. Like, every time I find a flaw in my brother, my sister, my neighbor, I feel a little better about myself, right? I feel a little superior, right? And so, speck removal is my spiritual gift. It's my hobby, right? It's my pastime. So this is the kind of thing going on in Jesus, what Jesus is talking about here. And what he says, when he says remove the log, he says you have to first not need to find a problem in somebody else to be okay, right? Once that need is gone, it allows me to see clearly, because as long as I kind of need to find something wrong in my neighbor to be okay, then it distorts how I look at them. I really cannot see clearly what is going on in that person's life. And so any kind of help I try to bring is going to actually be damaging. Okay? And so what happens is, if I don't remove that log, I end up trying to push advice on the person and try to get them to do what I want them to do. Right? And I think that's what's going on here in verse 6. Is he's described, I don't think he's saying some people are dogs, some people are pigs, give up on them now, they're not worthwhile. That's not Jesus, okay? So he says, don't give what is holy to dogs, don't cast pearls before pigs. Otherwise, they'll turn and trample them underfoot they'll trample them underfoot, and when they turn, they'll tear you to pieces, okay? And so I think what he's talking about here is that in both cases, if you talk about, pearls, holy things, dogs and swine, the point is simply that they're not usable. They're not usable. Like, if you take, a holy object, something dedicated at the temple, and you give it to a dog, it doesn't help. It's not gonna, if the dog's hungry, it's not going to fill its belly, right? And same thing with the pig. If you give it, you can give it all the pearls that it wants, but if it can't eat, eventually it's going to find one thing that's edible, and that may be your leg, right? Right? And so. And anybody who's spent time around hogs knows that they are carnivorous. So, anyhow, so the idea here is that as long as I'm like pushing advice, that's unusable. The response is predictable, and that is that it's going to cause a kind of backlash. That person's going to push back. And you think about it this way. When I get in somebody's face and I say, here's what you need to do, and I want you to do it now, why aren't you doing it? That creates a certain kind of relationship. It's a relationship of opposition. When I make demands or push advice that is not asked for, the response is going to be hostility. And you can think about it this way, as long as I'm in your face telling you what to do, what's the one problem you're very aware of? Me, right? It's me in your face. I mean, there may be other problems in one's life, right? But if I'm in your face, the one you're really aware of is me in your face, right? And so Jesus says, don't try pushing advice. Don't give your pearls of advice. And so the question then becomes, well, if that's not how we go about helping people change, how do we do it? What's the appropriate use of speech if it's not aggressive advice that's unasked for and displays of disapproval for what they're doing? That's the context in verse 7 and following. Okay? Ask, and it'll be given to you. Seek, and you'll find. Knock, and it'll be open. Everyone who asks receives. He who knocks, it's open. Or seeks finds. To him who knocks, it's open, right? The point of this is, like, don't shift too quickly to say that now we just pray. This is still about my relation to my brother, my sister, my neighbor. And this is the alternative to pushing advice. I ask. That's the alternative. The alternative to this, instead of pressure and aggressive advice, I ask instead. Okay? And you see, a different kind of relationship opens up. Now, I ask God, but I also ask my neighbor, my brother, my sister. You see, if when I'm in your face saying, you need to do this, Mosin, right, then I'm a problem. I'm the problem, okay? But there's a different kind of relationship that's established if I come and say, I'm concerned about this problem. Would you consider? Would you consider changing in this way? Would you think about this with me? Right? When I ask, it's different. Now, we all know there's ways of asking that aren't really asking, right? And so, we can twist this as well. But Jesus' point is that there's a possibility in coming to my brother and asking that's different from pushing. Okay? Because the relationship implied in this is one in which we stand together now. And together, we're going to walk through this. We're going to ask God for help as well. And it's a common cause now. Okay? And Jesus says, when you ask, you tend to get what you're asking for. Okay? Even with people who aren't that great, right? They still know how to give good gifts. And so when you bring the Father into it, you can count on it happening even better. Okay? All right. One last thing, one last distortion. And go ahead and turn over to Matthew 21. This is verse 23 and following. Matthew 21, verse 23 and following. And I'm just going to call this distortion of speech impression management. Or speaking to manage impressions, right? So what's happening in this context is that Jesus has been teaching in the temple. He's inviting people in that the scribes and the Pharisees are not happy about being in this place. And so, and he's also driven out people from the temple, the money gatherers and so forth. And so what happens at this point is that you have in verse 23 the teachers or the chief priests and the elders of the people coming to him while he's teaching and asking about his authority. Okay, by what authority do you do these things? And let's read verse 23 through 27, and then we'll go on from there. Somebody read it nice and loud.
When Jesus returned to the temple and began teaching, the leading priests and elders came up to him. They demanded, "By what authority are you doing all these things? Who gave you the right?" "I'll tell you by what authority I do these things if you answer one question," Jesus replied. "Did John's authority to baptize come from heaven, or was it merely human?" They talked it over among themselves. "If we say it was from heaven, he will ask us why we didn't believe John. But if we say it was merely human, we'll be mobbed because the people believe John was a prophet. So they finally replied, "We don't know." And Jesus responded, "Then I won't tell you by what authority I do these things."
Okay. All right. So what's going on here is Jesus is asked about his authority, and he has his counter question. Now, I think very often we read this as Jesus being more wily than those that he's interacting with. And it's as if he's a teacher and he teaches up until there's a controversy, and then he shifts into a different mode, right? And I don't think that's the right way to read this. I think we need to see Jesus as continuing to teach, but he's teaching by highlighting what the problem is in the hearts of the people he's working with. And so when they come and they say, "By what authority?" he asks them this question, well, by what authority is John? Right? And the point of his question is seen in how they respond. They don't give an honest answer. They don't speak straightforwardly. Instead, what they do is they kind of glance to the side. They have to see what other people are saying, thinking, before they can even respond. What that means is that they're not honestly trying to answer the question. Instead, they're trying to weigh the situation, and they're trying to manage the impression that it makes on the people around them, how they're going to look depending on what they say. Okay? And so the point of Jesus' question is they're having to assess what everybody else will think. They can't give an honest yes or no, heaven or earth question or answer to that question. So it's a simple question, but they can't speak truthfully because of this need to manage their impression on other people. And so what Jesus does is he says, well, if we can't speak honestly, right, then let's not talk about authority. Instead, let's talk about will. And so he tells this story then that goes from verse 28 through 32. And I'll just summarize it because we're kind of at the end of time here. But essentially he says there's this man has two sons. And one of them's kind of rough and, responds hastily in a bad mood. And the other one is kind of, he's the golden boy and does everything right. And so he comes out to the table one morning and he says, "I need you guys to work with me out in the farm today." And the one who's, kind of hasty and grumpy says, "No, I'm not going to do that. Hate it," and he gets up and he leaves. Right? And the other one, seeing a chance to show up his brother, says, "Oh, I would love to. I just love spending time with you, Dad," and all of that. And so he kind of, butters him up. But then something happens. The one who says, "I'd love to," he never shows up. Dad's out there working and golden boy doesn't come. The other son, the one who had kind of snapped and said, "I'm not going to do it," was insulting. He feels sorry for what he did, and he thinks about it, and he turns around and he goes and joins his dad in the work. And all afternoon, it's the grumpy son who's repented and come out and spent with his father in the field. And then Jesus just asked the question, which one actually did the will of the Father? Right? You see, it's not about the impression that's made. It's about what in our heart of hearts we decide to do, what we choose, whose will we're really seeking. And if we're really seeking the Father's will, then whether or not the impression is pleasant on the front end, it'll sort out okay. And so it's better to forget about it, kind of managing the impressions, to speak forthrightly, and to do that as we continue to seek the Father's will. Okay? So these are three kind of fundamental problems in our speech after sin, and ways to move beyond it. We let our yes be yes. Instead of pushing, we ask. Instead of managing impression, we speak forthrightly and seek the Father's will. Okay? All right. Any questions, comments, thoughts?